Hi guys, this is Arthur for FlopTurnRiver, and this is part 3 of the series where I analyze hands in heads-up situations and figure out how to get maximum value. So the first hand is against a good regular, and we're quite deep in this hand. I think this is always a call with Queen-Jack offsuit in this situation. Free betting is not horrible, but I would prefer for it to be at least suited to make a free bet, especially against a good regular who will flat or 4-bet quite a lot. So I flat and flop the nuts. Now if I was a more aggressive player at the time, I would probably just donk bet this flop for like a third of the pot. But since I wasn't really known for taking lines like that to most regulars, I figured that this was not the best time to start. So I check and he bets just under half the pot. Now check calling here is not bad, but against a good regular I think check raising has more value. Since I'm out of position here, it's going to be hard to remain in control of the pot on the turn and build it up if I just check call. This is not a particularly dry board, and any scare card on the turn might force him to slow down or shut down entirely, and it's not likely that he will be putting 2 barrels anyway, unless he has a top pair or a flush draw or possibly ace-jack. Raising on the other hand surely won't deter him from continuing with most of his value range here. After all, this is heads up. So I make a smallish re-raise and he just jams and I snap call him. He ended up having second pair, and like I mentioned in the previous part of the series, regulars tend to get it in way too light heads up, so in many situations there is no need to slow play monster flops. In this next hand I'm up against the regular again, and he seems to be pretty solid. I open from the button and he flats. Now against fish I would be barreling this flop all day, but since he's a regular I should have probably checked this flop, since he's probably not calling with worse here. He might even fold an 8 or a flop like this, and even if he calls with an 8, he's definitely not calling 2 barrels unless he improves. So I barrel into him and he calls, which makes me want to shut down immediately, but I turn trips, which is great for my perceived range. I'm sure he would expect me to check back a king on that flop, and since I barreled it and the king rolled out, it is hard for him to put me on a king at this point, especially when I put in another half-pot bet on the turn. When he calls, I'm almost certain that he has an ace, and fortunately for me the line I took makes it very hard for him to believe that I have a king at this point, and the queen on the river makes things even better for me. Now he can expect a chop with any ace that I might have, and basically the only thing he needs to worry about is the king, and it's pretty hard for him to put me on it after my flop line. Since I might have a decent number of bluffs in my range here on the river, and my opponent knows that he's going to be splitting all the aces, I think he is very likely to call in this situation, so I decide to bet pretty big. In fact, I think I might have bet too big, and something like 4k would have been good here. He decided to pay me off anyway, and he did have an ace. Now let's look at the last hand where I'm up against a fishy player. I open from the button and he flats. We're still pretty deep, so there's room for some post-flop play. The flop is pretty good, since most of the time he will just fold to a c-bet on a flop like this, but this time he calls. At this point he probably caught at least some piece of this flop, or he might even call me with ace high here. Either way, I think he's pretty weak here, and if it came down to it, I would probably fire 3 barrels here as a bluff on blank cards, because I don't think that his range here could stand that much pressure. Fortunately, I didn't have to do any of that as I hit the best turn card possible, and now the question is, how do I get all of the chips in the pot? I don't think there's any reason to try to pinpoint his range here, because there is simply no way we're checking back here. He might have a 7 here, which he will get it in on the river, but that will play out itself. If on the other hand he has something like ace-6, he will definitely be paying off small to medium bets here, and that's the only right play here. So he calls another barrel, and at this point he has less than a pot size bet left and checks again. Now this might be a mistake, but I don't think he has the type of hand that it takes to call off a shove here, even for a fish. I don't think he has a lot of deuces in his range either. He might have an ace-deuce and try to slow play it, but that doesn't seem very likely. So instead of a shove here, I prefer something like a pot-sized bet, which might get called by a pair-type hand. Sometimes in spots like this, fishy players may simply call off the half-pot bet, and because they know that they'll have some chips left, while as if they call off a shove and lose, they know that they're out. So he does call with top pair, and that's a bad call by him. So that's it for this part. Stay tuned for the last part of this series, and thanks for watching. And